Please note this podcast discusses real-life crimes and may include sensitive topics such as violence, abuse, and other disturbing content. We recommend listener discretion.
And I remember a young scallywag. He came to me one day after the police had stopped digging at Cromwell Street and said, "Would you like to see inside the House of Horrors?" And of course, there was only one answer.
I'm journalist Helen Fospero.
I'm crime reporter Martin Brunt.
And this is True Criminals.
A journey into the darkest corners of the criminal underworld with insights from decades of true crime reporting.
The stories behind the stories, plus exclusive interviews with those closely involved in notorious cases.
Re-examining crimes so shocking, they still haunt our imaginations.
Hello and welcome to True Criminals. We're starting with a double episode on a story which must rank as the most gruesome case of serial murder in British history. A story of rape, torture, incest, and at least 12 murders, perhaps more, between 1967 and 1987, perpetrated by husband and wife Fred and Rose West. A case which unfolded in front of a horrified nation in 1994 and 95 and left many asking how this couple's terrible crimes went undetected for decades.
In this first episode, we'll reflect on our own work on the case, and in the next episode, talk to Howard Soons, the Fleet Street journalist who broke the first major story about the Wests and has written the definitive biography of Fred and Rose.
Martin, when did you first hear about 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester, a house that would become so infamous it ended up being bulldozed and torn down?
It seems odd to look back now, but it was a slow burn story. Some of the biggest crime stories don't just explode overnight with massive headlines. This was a story that began in a very small way with some early reports in the Gloucester Evening newspaper. Police had told the local reporters that they were digging for human remains in the back garden of a house near the city centre of Gloucester. And then the police let it be known that human remains had been found. It was still a local newspaper story then. I think perhaps our West Country bureau reporter may have picked up something of what was going on, but it wasn't enough to spark national media interest. And then we were told that it was reported in the local paper that a man had been arrested on suspicion of the murder of his daughter. And then that was something that finally made Fleet Street, a couple of paragraphs that somebody had been arrested for the murder of his daughter. But even that wasn't that unusual. I mean, most people who are murdered by people they know, often by family members. But it was another, I suppose, a week or so before this then became the big story. And it was the Sunday Mirror, my old newspaper, that broke it. Howard Soons, their crime reporter, had a very good source in Gloucester. And Howard, for the first time, began to report the extent of what police were discovering and the idea that it wasn't just one body buried in the garden of this house in Cromwell Street. There were quite a few more. And so it became a national story, and I was dispatched to Gloucester, where I spent the best part of the next 3 months delving into this dreadful tale.
This is about unimaginable, sadistic crimes perpetrated over decades. Can you give us a sense, Martin, of who the Wests were and what they did?
Well, Fred West was a jobbing builder. His wife was the matriarch of the family. They had lots of kids. They'd got together when they were quite young. I mean, Fred was, 12 years older than Rose. She was quite young when they met, formed a relationship, had a family. But they were, to all intents and purposes, a happily married couple with a big family and a mortgage. Perhaps, the best cover for a couple who were mass murderers. But in the very early days, we knew nothing. Nobody knew anything about what they were up to. But Fred was the first to kill. He killed his pregnant lover. Then he killed his first wife. By that time, he was together with Rose, and she was responsible for the murder of a young girl in her care who was Fred's stepdaughter. And then a couple of years later, for some reason yet to be explored, they embarked on a killing spree of young women.
What kind of things went on behind the walls at 25 Cromwell Street, which was really an unremarkable house in an unremarkable street?
It's a job to know where to start, because the depravity of this couple was something that I'd never encountered. And I don't think any of my fellow crime reporters who were there in the early days really got to grips with the extent of what this couple were doing. But essentially, during the 70s, starting in about 1973, they were cruising the streets of Gloucester and beyond and looking for vulnerable young women. And they found them either at bus stops, waiting for buses. They found them hitchhiking. One or two found their own way to Cromwell Street. These were runaway girls from care homes. They were mostly young, vulnerable females. And Fred and Rose presented themselves as this happy-go-lucky, not unattractive couple, always smiling. They reminded me of Pop and Ma Larkin from the TV series The Darling Buds of May.
Did they?
And if you look at photographs of the two actors, Pam Ferris and Del Boy, they look so much like those early photographs of Fred and Rose. So to their victims, they presented this harmless, smiley couple who were willing to help by giving them a lift, saving them the bus fare, giving them rooms to lodge in at their house in Cromwell Street. But of course, once those young women were in their clutches, that's when the horror stories started. And those victims, almost all of them, were taken down into the cellar, were abused, were tied up, were raped by both Fred and Rose, and then were murdered. And it's difficult even now just to dwell on the horror that those poor young ladies, women, went through.
The layout of the house was unusual too, wasn't it? Because Rose was working as a prostitute and their sexual appetite was, well, shall we say unusual to say the least. A lot of sexual behaviour and depraved sexual behaviour was going on, and sadistic stuff, wasn't it, at Cromwell Street?
They were both sexually depraved, and you could look for hints of why that was so from their own childhood. They were both, to all intents and purposes, abused sexually, abused physically when they were growing up. So the kind of behaviour that they then showed to their victims had become normal for them. They had voracious sexual appetite. I mean, Fred particularly was a deviant in his sexual appetites. And all of this was inflicted on their victims. People talk about criminals being evil, and I've never really thought that you could describe anybody as wholly evil until I encountered the story of Fred West, who seemed to derive simple pleasure from inflicting torture and death on his victims. And I think to some extent that's true of Rose. I mean, certainly the jury's verdict in her trial was that she was equally as culpable as Fred was for the murder of those young women.
I think Rose killed a child when she was 17. What turned the tide, if you like, that led Rose and Fred to not just torturing and abusing their victims, but also getting rid of them, and getting rid of them in a shocking fashion? I mean, Fred dismembered bodies, didn't he, and decapitated them?
Yes, Fred was a slaughterman at one point in his very checkered working life. So dismembering bodies, I think, probably came more natural to him than to most killers. So the two of them had both killed before they embarked on this killing spree of young women. It was, I suppose, their relationship with a woman called Caroline Owens that ultimately led to the murder of the women who came afterwards. Caroline Owens was a woman they had befriended. She moved into their house at Cromwell Street, like a lot of these young women, ostensibly to be the nanny to their growing family. And of course, as soon as she was there, then she became a target of Fred and Rose, who tried to engage her in their sexual practices. She refused and she left. And then sometime later, they saw her on the streets of Cheltenham and they essentially abducted her, took her back to Cromwell Street, and then put her through the kind of ordeal that the later victims were to go through. So they tied her up, they tortured her, they raped her, and then they let her go. And she went to the police and the couple were arrested, and Caroline Owens refused eventually to give evidence against them. So essentially, Fred and Rose were charged with a minor offence. They weren't charged with rape. If they had been, they might have gone to prison. And if they'd gone to prison, then perhaps the other victims would have been spared. But I think it's generally accepted that Fred and Rose felt they got away with it. But they also learned a lesson that if they were to continue to inflict that kind of sexual torture on future victims, then those victims would not be allowed to survive.
And why did Caroline's case not lead to a conviction of something more serious?
She told me some years later that she was so badly treated by the detective who interviewed her that she felt intimidated, she felt ashamed of her part in the sexual activity with Fred and Rose, even though she said she'd been raped and nobody would doubt that. The police detective refused to believe her, cajoled her into, aspects of her own behaviour, saying to her that she'd had lots of boyfriends, she was up for it, did it get a bit rough, is that all that happened? And she felt so awful about that experience that in the end, having reported it to police, she decided that she wouldn't give evidence. And she said to me that she wished to her dying day that she had given evidence because she felt guilty about all those women who followed because they were murdered. And if she had given evidence and the Wests had gone to jail, she thinks those women would have been spared.
When she saw what unfolded at 25 Cromwell Street and when the digging happened and body after body or remains after remains were found, she must have felt very lucky that she hadn't ended up under the patio. And I think she said at the trial that she'd changed in her mind from being a Fred and Rose victim to a survivor, which indeed she was, wasn't she?
She was. I mean, she said to me in an interview that Fred had warned her not to go to the police with a very direct threat. He said, there are hundreds of bodies under the paving stones of Gloucester that I put there. So she felt very, very lucky that she hadn't become a victim, a murder victim. And she found it very difficult to explain why, because she was put through this ordeal of being tied up and raped by both of them. And it was mostly Rose, she said, who was her attacker. And Fred raped her at the end very quickly and burst into tears and was very apologetic to her for what he'd done. And she found that a very curious reaction. And maybe for some reason, Fred for once felt some remorse, and that was enough to enable her to escape.
Their cruelty and torture and wickedness really did know no bounds. In our second episode, we'll be talking to Howard Soons, who wrote what is seen as the definitive book on Fred and Rose. And the chapters I found the most difficult to read is what both of them, both mum and dad, did to their 8-year-old daughter, Anne-Marie.
I've sat through a lot of courtroom testimonies over the years, and I don't think I've heard anything quite as awful as the testimony of Anne-Marie, who was Fred's daughter by his first wife, so Rose West's stepdaughter. And she, in very chilling terms, in a very silent courtroom, began to tell the jury what her experience was. And she said that from about the age of 8, on a regular basis, Fred and Rose would take her down to the cellar, telling her that what was about to happen was for her own good. And what followed was that she was tied up, she was raped by Fred, she was sexually abused with a vibrator by Rose. And all the time this was happening, they were telling her that she should be grateful. This is the way that parents show their love for a daughter. And in some ways they were preparing her to be a good wife in coming years. And she went into dreadful detail about how the pain was unbearable, how she begged them to stop, but they wouldn't. They just continued. She gave evidence over 2 or 3 days, and her evidence was interrupted one night when she tried to commit suicide. But she recovered and came back to court and continued in the same way, with the most appalling details. And I think all of us who were crammed into those press benches felt that this was perhaps the most extraordinary courtroom testimony that we'd ever heard. But, for me, the most chilling aspect of it, the bit that really bothered me, was that every morning Anne-Marie said she used to go to school and catch up with her classmates, thinking, because of what her parents had told her, that they were doing her a favour. This was how parents showed their love for their children. She just assumed that all her classmates were going through the same kind of ordeal on a regular basis at the hands of their own parents, not thinking for a minute that, she was alone in what was being done to her. And I thought that was the grimmest part of that whole episode.
How on earth, Martin, did this go on for 2 decades without anybody realising what was happening in Cromwell Street?
Nobody joined the dots. And it's difficult to think that didn't happen, today, when so much stuff is recorded digitally, where agencies have learned, perhaps through some of the mistakes that were made during the Cromwell Street investigation, agencies have learned to talk to one another, to share information. The idea in Charmaine West's case that she could suddenly not turn up at school and nobody bothered to find out what had happened to her, when her parents just said she's gone to London with her mother. Nobody followed that up. Nobody wanted to check that she was with her mother. That's one example of the failings that happened. The kids were in and out of social services care. Police and social workers turned up at the house occasionally when there were reports of the kids being neglected. School teachers must have seen the physical marks of the beatings that the children had inflicted on them. The kids sometimes went to hospital with wounds that you would have thought might have prompted a closer inspection and a need to know exactly why so many children from this one family were turning up in hospital. But the dots were not joined, and one of the great learning lessons from the Cromwell Street investigation is that there were those failings. And I'm sure certainly in Gloucestershire and elsewhere, agencies began to learn the need to share information.
You talk about not connecting the dots in terms of social services, police, hospital staff, etc. But I suppose what was also different was the times we were living in. Young women hitchhike, we didn't have mobile phones, there wasn't this big social media network. And so I suppose when young women went missing, there wasn't the same connection as there would be perhaps today.
It's extraordinary to think that I think half a dozen of the young women victims weren't even reported missing to the police. And I think there are some questions perhaps to be asked about their families. Why wasn't a bigger effort made to find them? But it wasn't easy. As you say, no mobile phones, no social media. If a young woman left home and didn't come back, I suppose families thought, particularly in the case of, as some of these girls were, rather headstrong, rebellious, thought that they would turn up eventually, and as time went on, that hope perhaps faded, and by then maybe it was too late to alert the authorities. Young girls did hitchhike around. I remember my own sister when she was going to university, and I can't believe my parents weren't concerned about her, but she regularly used to hitchhike up and down the A1 to Hull University from Cambridgeshire, at a time when there was at least one notorious lorry driver who was murdering young women. So it was quite normal for girls to be out on their own, hitchhiking, taking buses on their own. And some of the victims, of course, were living in care homes. And when they got to 16, they could no longer be kept in a care home. So they left. Some of them found their way to Cromwell Street because it was known as a place where young women were welcome. There was a kind of social life there, and these were often very vulnerable, unloved young women, teenagers, who suddenly found warmth and a certain happiness, so they thought, inside 25 Cromwell Street. So it's no surprise that they might have been attracted there. But again, if a girl became 16 and left a care home, it seems nobody really bothered about where they went from there.
In addition to co-hosting True Criminals, Helen hosts her own award-winning podcast, The Convex Conversation. If you're eager to learn more about the inspiring guests she interviews, from royalty to astronauts, from industry leaders to explorers, check it out at convex.podbean.com or search The Convex Conversation on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to yours.
And if you're curious to dive deeper into Martin's work as a crime reporter, I had the pleasure of interviewing him about his book, No One Got Cracked Over the Head for No Reason, Dispatches from a Crime Reporter, on my podcast. In this episode, Martin shares some gripping stories that resonate with the themes we explore here on True Criminals. You can find links to that episode in our show notes or on the True Criminals page at audiobleachglobal.com. How were the Wests finally caught, Martin?
It's a kind of long story, but in the early 90s, there were two things that happened, I think. There was concern that some of the kids were being neglected, were being left on their own by their parents. So social services made a couple of unannounced visits to the house, didn't find any evidence that concerned them so much. So they got there, had a look round, and then left. And whether any notes were made of that visit, whether it was logged anywhere, I don't know. And then sometime afterwards, there was a conversation between two young girls and an allegation that Fred had raped one of them. And the other girl went to her parents, who then went to the police, and a police investigation was begun. And Fred and Rose were arrested, taken into custody, which meant that the kids had to be taken into care. And although that potential prosecution came to nothing because of the reluctance of a witness to give evidence, the story that was the West's undoing began to unravel. And it's all about Heather, their daughter, who vanished herself when she was 16. And one of the kids said to a social worker that they were often threatened about their behaviour by their parents and told, if you don't behave, you'll end up under the patio like your sister Heather. And it became a family joke. But it began to be told more than once. And one of the detectives involved in that investigation that went nowhere in about 1992 was Hazel Savage, a detective who had encountered Fred many years ago on some other investigation. And the idea of this story, this family joke that Heather was buried under the patio, stuck with her, and she was determined to get to the bottom of it. So she made lots of inquiries and could find no trace of Heather. And eventually she persuaded her bosses at Gloucestershire Police to get a search warrant and to go looking under the patio in the back garden of 25 Cromwell Street. And that's where the undoing of Fred and Rose began. The police dug, they found Heather's remains, and then they kept digging, by which time Fred and Rose were back in custody, and Fred, for the first time, began to make admissions about how he'd murdered Heather.
There were new developments, I remember, in this case almost daily. Give us a sense of what the day-to-day reporting was like on the investigation when the digging had started in their back garden.
It was a very unusual, fascinating time to be a crime reporter in those days. And I had just become the crime correspondent at Sky News. So I was working for Britain's first 24-hour news channel. And I guess this was a story that was heaven-made for a running news organisation where every twist and turn could be reported almost as they happened. And other TV channels didn't have a 24-hour news service. So our rivals, ITV and BBC, had their fixed bulletins at various times during the day. But we always managed to keep ahead of them because things were happening pretty quickly. And it's one of my abiding memories is spending so much time standing outside the front of 25 Cromwell Street and watching how the forensic team every now and then would emerge carrying a box with a lid on it in a very solemn way. And there was none of the feeding frenzy that you often get in these circumstances around murder scenes where activity is still going on. I think there was such a respect because we realised that in each box were the remains of a victim. So these forensic officers were bringing out these boxes of remains, you know, in a kind of hushed atmosphere and loading them onto the van and taking them away. And then, you know, perhaps within another day or so, there would be more. So we were filming what was coming out of the front of the house, but also we were at the back of the house watching the police dig as it went on day after day. And it just became busy because as well as that activity, we were also being told quite a lot by the police about the progress they were making in their investigation. You'll remember there were two press officers who were assigned to the press pack, and they were unusual in that they were there all the time and they were feeding us details of the progress of the investigation. So that it seemed almost on a daily basis there was something new to report. There were official press conferences as well when there were big developments. There were court appearances as Rose and Fred were charged increasingly with more murder charges. It was an incredibly busy time, and as well as trying to cover those daily developments, you know, you and I and our colleagues were also scouring around trying to find witnesses we could talk to who would be useful as part of our documentary to be done at the end of the trial, whenever that happened.
I was working as a young producer while alongside you at Sky and orchestrating Sky's coverage. And I remember when I left our studios in London to head to Gloucester, our news editor, Chris Hampson, said to me, your first mission on the ground is to get a vantage point. We need to see the West back garden and need to see where the police are digging. So quite naively, I remember walking up the back street and walking into a house lived in by a big Indian family. There were always delicious smells of dal and curry emanating from the kitchen. And I said, is it okay if we build a platform at the bottom of your garden to look over the dig?
Expecting them to say no.
Expecting them to say no. And they said yes. And you'll remember I shared it with our colleagues. The deal was, you know, we'd have to share it with ITN and the BBC and we'd all have space looking over the dig. And my news editor arrived, or our news editor arrived in the field, took one look at the platform. I was quite chuffed with the location I'd sorted for our lives. And he said to me, Helen, this is ridiculous. He said, the second the police see this, you'll be taking that platform down. And I remember having a slightly smug smile when Live at 5, which was our big show in those days, we welcomed the leading detective in the case, who very willingly stood on our platform and talked about what he could see. And my theory, looking back on that, was the information and the detail that the police shared with us, often over a drink at the end of a day in private. I think it was a crime unlike any other that had shocked them to the core, and they were determined that the world saw the horror that was going on there.
I think that's true, and I think they also wanted the public to see the extent of their investigation, because always at the back of the minds of detectives on big investigations is, how much money is being spent. And I think they wanted people also to see the extent of that dig. And what was quite extraordinary was that we were allowed access. I mean, if you could get a vantage point, as you did, then they didn't stop us doing it. And normally we are used to, and our viewers are used to, big tents being put over crime scenes, particularly where there is forensic digging going on. But, I mean, there were, I think, one or two tents at some point in that garden. But ostensibly, we were able to film over that fortnight in which the bodies were discovered. The police digging away with their little mini digger, using a radar scanner as well.
And a little sieve. I remember them shaking the soil.
Yeah, we got quite an extraordinary glimpse into, the nature of that investigation. And if you look back now, they are still very, very vivid images of what was going on. And of course, in the early stages, we didn't know quite what they were going to find. But then, when it began to emerge that there were, I think, at least 3 bodies under that rather small, narrow garden, and then more inside the house, underneath the cellar, we began to grasp the nature of this, I suppose, unique story. I mean, it is unique, the Fred and Rose West story.
You also got into what became known as the House of Horrors through the attic after the forensic teams had done their work. What was that like, and what memories do you have of actually being inside?
As well as all the daily events of a breaking, moving, major investigation that we had to cover, we were also looking for our own scoops. And I remember a young scallywag who we'll call Jim coming up to me. He'd already introduced me to some of the characters around the street. I mean, some very strange people, life's flotsam and jetsam, some very, very vulnerable people who were down on their luck, had suffered appalling misfortune and gravitated to this, down at heel area of Gloucester and become friends of Fred and Rose. And he came to me one day after the police had stopped digging at Cromwell Street and said, "Would you like to see inside the House of Horrors?" And of course, there was only one answer. And he wanted 300 quid, and that seemed quite cheap. I'd just driven back home to Sussex when he called me. So I had to move very quickly. So I phoned our local cameraman. He met Jim, 1 o'clock in the morning in Wellington Street, around the corner from Cromwell Street. And I spoke to the cameraman again recently, and he still doesn't want to be identified. He still feels rather guilty about what happened. So anyway, Jim led him to next door to number 23 Cromwell Street, which was the other side of 25, 2 adjoining semi-detached properties. And the cameraman still says, "I don't remember a key being used. We just walked up to the door and walked in." So they walked into number 23, walked up 3 flights, opened a loft hatch, hauled themselves up, went across this shared attic with number 25, pulled up another loft hatch, and as the cameraman said, we dropped down onto the top floor, and suddenly I was inside the House of Horrors. And the first thing he filmed was a discarded rubber glove, presumably left by one of the forensic team. The police and the forensic officers had all quit the house by now. I can't remember whether there was still a police bobby guarding the front door, But if there was, he didn't detect what was going on inside that night. So very quickly, because they didn't want to get caught, Jim led the cameraman down the 3 flights of stairs, filming a very boring, mundane series of rooms that had been stripped of furnishings and fittings by the police and the forensic searchers, down into the cellar where there was a trapdoor and a ladder. So it seemed that if there were stairs, they'd been removed during the investigation, and down onto the floor of the cellar where there were these odd childish drawings on the walls. There was a cowboy figure, some childish writing. But the distinctive thing was there was evidence where 5 holes had been dug by the police and then a screed had been put over them. And that's where, by then we knew that they had found the bodies of 5 of the victims buried in the cellar. And the cameraman, all the time he was filming this, said, he felt it very macabre. He wanted to film quickly so they could get out before they were caught. And Jim, his guide, was telling him, we must go soon. And then it was afterwards I realised that the reason Jim wanted to get my cameraman out so quickly was that he had our rival camera crews waiting round the corner to do their shift inside the House of Horrors. So
you'd find a little business that had come out of all this horror, and he was obviously making the most of it, old Jim.
Yes, I didn't have a problem with the locals making some money out of this huge media interest. Why not?
That must have been very difficult to listen to, I'd imagine. But what kept the children's silence? Was it fear? I mean, I know that in 25 Cromwell Street, Rose had her own area where she entertained her so-called men friends, and the children were banned from going through certain doors. But was that house ruled with fear that meant the children knew they couldn't confess to anybody or confide in anybody?
It's difficult to know exactly what was going on in the house. And we do have the testimony of some of the children. I mean, a couple of them wrote books. And yes, they were ruled by fear. I mean, some of them were abused physically and sexually, certainly by Fred. So it was a pretty grim existence. But at the same time, it was, and this might sound odd, it was a rather loving family, because Fred and Rose used to regularly go to school evenings with their children. They would take them out on trips. They would walk them in the park. They would, to observers, appear to be a very happy family. And I don't think for a minute that it was all horror inside the House of Horrors. I think there were days, weeks, maybe months of very happy family life inside that house. So I think there was a certain loyalty from the children to their parents, and I guess the bad stuff just became normal. And certainly in the case of Anne-Marie, she thought all kids were being subjected to those horrors.
The children over the years were in and out of care. They were regularly fostered when it seemed that perhaps Fred and Rose had had enough of them or a bit overwhelmed, or indeed Fred was in prison for petty crime. They were known to the authorities, they were known to police, they were known to social services. What happened to Fred and Rose in terms of trial-wise, and what became of them?
Fred hanged himself about 9 or 10 months before he was due to stand trial with Rose at Winchester Crown Court. So that was New Year's Eve, New Year's Day in 1995. And that robbed all of us, I suppose, the criminal justice system, the victims' families and the media, of the spectacle of Fred and Rose standing side by side in the dock. So 10 months later, Rose stood trial. Fred had been charged with 12 murders. And at various times in his police interviews, he had admitted some of them and then he'd denied them. He'd admitted more to a woman called Janet Leach, who was his kind of independent witness during his police interviews, but he spoke to her privately, seemed to have built up quite a close relationship with her, and admitted killing a number of his victims. But he was charged, so he never stood trial. Rose West denied the 10 murders she was facing, the murder of Charmaine West, the murder of Heather, her own daughter, and the 8 other young women whose bodies were found buried under Cromwell Street. She blamed it on Fred, said she had no idea what Fred was up to. There were a string of witnesses who gave evidence over the 2 months of the trial, who talked about the sexual depravity of both of them. Some who said that Rose was as vicious and vindictive and as sexually depraved as her husband. Others said maybe not so much. But in the end, the jury convicted Rose of all 10 murders, and she was jailed for life. And I remember the judge saying in very few words on her conviction that she was jailed for life, that was mandatory. And he said that if the authorities were to listen to him, she would never be released. And she never has been released. And she is one of the few women prisoners in UK jails to be subject to a whole life tariff, which means she's very, very unlikely to ever be released.
What were your impressions of Rose in the doc, Martin? Did she show any kind of emotion or remorse or anything like that?
She was very cold. Very seldom was there any real emotion. And when she did appear to cry, I think there was a feeling that she was turning it on for the jury. Never any remorse. I mean, remember, she denied doing any of this, so she could hardly show remorse or apologise for what she said she hadn't done. And as far as I know, she has never offered to help the police or to help the families of the victims that she killed. She's stayed in jail. Occasionally reports emerge of her behaviour, her relationships with other prisoners, with prison staff. But it doesn't appear that she's got any capacity or any inclination to say anything ever about what she did.
As we begin to wind down our first episode together, Martin, it begs the question from me, when you look back at your 4 decades of crime reporting, does this go down as the most horrific story that you've ever covered in your career?
Is it really 4 decades?
Sorry.
People often ask me, what's the worst case you've ever covered? I mean, it's a traditional question, I suppose, particularly for crime reporters. And in 1994, when I started covering the Cromwell Street murders, at the time, as it began to unravel and the sheer depravity over such a long time of this couple, it did become the worst case I'd ever covered. I thought it then, and I still think it is now. I mean, I've covered many cases since, but I don't think anything has ever reached the scale of depravity, killing their own children, the level of torture and unpleasantness and pain that was inflicted on their victims. Nothing has matched it. I don't think anything has ever come close to the story of the House of Horrors.
My abiding memory will always be the officer with the black box you described with the remains in, with a moustache, quite a tall officer, calmly, quietly, respectfully walking out of the front door of 25 Cromwell Street. And you summed that up really beautifully. There was a lot of respect and just shock in that town. Well, those are some of our memories of this case, but it's so grim and shocking. It begs many more questions even after so many years. Why did the West do it? How did they get away with their killings for so long? How did two such depraved people find and shape each other? And how many more bodies are there? To help us explore these questions and go down the 25 Cromwell Street rabbit holes, in part 2, we're going to Britain's foremost expert on Fred and Rose. Hey listeners, True Criminals is a new show and your support means everything to us. If you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to leave us a review. It helps us grow, reach new listeners, and keep bringing you the stories you love. This episode is brought to you by Audio Bleach Global. Our senior producer is Russell Barnes, with mixing by Andrew Chappell. The original score was composed by Chap Mannequin, artwork by Bleached, executive produced by Lee Mann. Follow True Criminals on Instagram at true.criminals and on YouTube at youtube.com/@true-criminals. For exclusive content and ways to support the show, visit us at patreon.com/True Criminals. For partnership opportunities, please contact us at contact@audiobleachglobal.com.